There are moments in history when the world simply ends. Not with a bang, not with a flood or a fire, but with silence. With a slow, creeping realization that something fundamental has broken. That the letters stop arriving. That the ships stop coming. That the palaces stand empty and the forges grow cold. Around 3,200 years ago, in the space of just a few human generations, nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean world collapsed. The Hittite Empire vanished almost overnight. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Trade routes that had carried goods across thousands of miles simply ceased to exist. Writing systems disappeared. And when the smoke cleared, the world entered what historians call a dark age, a period of cultural amnesia that would last for 400 years. This wasn't a local disaster. This wasn't a single kingdom falling to invaders or a plague sweeping through one region. This was systemic collapse on a scale humanity had never seen before. And the truly haunting part is this. We still don't fully understand why it happened. The evidence points in a dozen different directions. Climate change, earthquakes, mysterious invaders from the sea, internal rebellions, economic collapse, or perhaps all of these things at once converging in what some scholars call a perfect storm. Tonight, we're going to walk through the ruins of that lost world. We're going to examine the evidence, the theories, and the lingering mysteries. So settle in, let the day fade away, and let's explore one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in human history. Before we understand the collapse, we need to understand what was lost. Because the Late Bronze Age, particularly in its final centuries, was an era of remarkable sophistication. For more than 300 years, from roughly 1500 BCE to 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean region was home to a complex interconnected world that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. This was an age of what we might recognise as early globalisation, a vast network of trade, diplomacy and cultural exchange that stretched from Italy in the west to Afghanistan in the east, from the Anatolian Plateau in the north to the cataracts of the Nile in the south. At the heart of this world was what historians sometimes call the Great Powers Club. The major civilizations of the day maintained regular contact with one another through an elaborate system of diplomatic correspondence. The pharaohs of Egypt ruled from their capitals along the Nile, commanding resources that seemed limitless to their neighbours. The Hittite kings controlled most of Anatolia, what we now call Turkey, from their mountain fortress city of Hattusa. The Mycenaean Greeks, though never united under a single ruler, commanded fleets that sailed throughout the Aegean and beyond. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians and Babylonians maintained their ancient traditions of learning and administration. These weren't isolated kingdoms, they were in constant communication. Royal archives discovered at sites across the Near East contain hundreds of letters between kings, discussing marriages, military alliances, trade agreements, and complaints. The letters are surprisingly personal at times. Kings addressed each other as brothers, even when they'd never met. They exchanged gifts of extraordinary value, gold statues and precious stones and rare woods, as demonstrations of their wealth and friendship. They arranged marriages between their children to cement alliances. They borrowed each other's artisans and craftsmen. This diplomatic network was backed by an economic system of breathtaking complexity. Trade goods moved along routes that spanned continents. A merchant ship leaving Cyprus might carry copper ingots to Egypt and return laden with gold and grain. Tin from as far away as Afghanistan travelled overland through dozens of intermediate hands before reaching the bronze smiths of the Aegean. Amber from the Baltic found its way to the grave goods of Mycenaean nobles. Ivory from African elephants was carved by Syrian craftsmen and sold to Greek princes. Perhaps the best single piece of evidence for this interconnected world comes from the seafloor off the coast of modern Turkey. In the late 1400s BCE, a merchant ship sank near a place called Uluburun. When archaeologists excavated the wreck in the 1980s, they discovered a cargo that read like a catalogue of the Bronze Age world. There were over 300 copper ingots, each weighing about 29 kilograms, shaped like stretched ox hides for easier stacking and transport. There were 40 tin ingots, the crucial ingredient needed to turn copper into bronze. There was a ton of terebinth resin from the Levantine coast, used in perfumes and medicines. There were ivory tusks, ostrich eggs, ebony from Africa, and glass ingots in shimmering blue and purple. The ship carried luxury items too: golden jewellery, scarabs from Egypt, cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, swords and spearheads, precious beads. The cargo represented goods from at least 7 different cultures. This was not some royal treasure fleet. This was a regular merchant vessel, and its contents demonstrate the routine nature of long-distance trade in the Late Bronze Age. Goods from one end of the known world travelled to the other, changing hands multiple times along the way, creating wealth and dependency in equal measure. The palace economies of the great civilizations depended on this trade. Bronze itself was a metal that required international cooperation to produce. Copper was relatively common and could be mined in Cyprus, Anatolia, Sardinia, and other locations. The island of Cyprus in particular was so rich in copper that ancient sources describe it as a land of abundant metal. Copper mines there had been worked for centuries, and Cypriot copper travelled throughout the Mediterranean world, often cast into distinctive ingots shaped like stretched ox hides, each weighing about 29 kilograms. These standardized ingots made transportation and trade more efficient, a kind of ancient mass production. But tin was rare. Tin deposits are geologically uncommon, and the ones available to Bronze Age peoples were scattered across enormous distances. Tin deposits existed in Cornwall and Devon in Britain, in Brittany and northwestern France, in the Ouray Mountains between modern Germany and the Czech Republic, in Iberia, and possibly in Central Asia, perhaps modern Afghanistan or Uzbekistan. Some scholars believe that much of the Bronze Age world's tin came from deposits thousands of miles from the Mediterranean. The evidence for long-distance tin trade is compelling. Chemical and isotopic analysis of tin ingots recovered from Bronze Age shipwrecks has shown that some tin found in the eastern Mediterranean originated in Cornwall on the far western edge of the known world. Imagine what this means in practical terms. Tin miners in Cornwall would extract cassiterite ore from the ground. This tin would then begin a journey of thousands of miles, passing through countless hands. It might travel by boat to Brittany, then down the Atlantic coast to the Strait of Gibraltar, then into the Mediterranean. Or it might go overland through Gaul and into Central Europe, then along river systems toward the south. At various ports and trading posts along the way, merchants would exchange goods, adding their markup to the cost. By the time Cornish tin reached a bronze smith in Mycenae or Ugarit, it had been traded multiple times, had travelled for months or even years, and had increased enormously in value. This meant that bronze working depended on maintaining secure trade routes across vast distances. If those routes were disrupted, if conflicts blocked the passes or pirates made the sea lanes dangerous, if drought depopulated the trading posts, the tin stopped flowing. And when the tin supply was interrupted, the entire economic and military structure of these societies was threatened. Armies needed bronze weapons. Agricultural expansion required bronze tools. Elite status was displayed through bronze vessels and ornaments. Without tin, none of this was possible. And it wasn't just raw materials. The Late Bronze Age saw the development of sophisticated administrative systems to manage all this complexity. The Mycenaean palaces employed hundreds of scribes who kept detailed records on clay tablets, tracking everything from sheep counts to chariot inventories to textile production. The linear B writing system they used wasn't for literature or history, it was pure bureaucracy, a tool for managing the intricate economy of the palace state. In Egypt, the administrative apparatus was even more developed, with hierarchies of officials overseeing tax collection, grain storage, military supplies, and construction projects. So when we talk about the Bronze Age collapse, we're talking about the disintegration of all of this. An entire system of international relations, trade networks, administrative structures, and cultural achievements built up over centuries, coming apart in the span of a few generations. To truly appreciate what collapsed, we need to understand bronze itself. Because bronze wasn't just a metal, it was the foundation of an entire economic and social system. It was the reason for the interconnectedness, the driver of the trade networks, the measure of wealth and power. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, typically in a ratio of about 90% copper to 10% tin. This might seem like a minor technical detail, but it represented a technological revolution. Pure copper is too soft for many practical purposes. It bends, it dulls quickly, it can't hold an edge. But add a small amount of tin, and something remarkable happens. The resulting alloy is significantly harder, more durable, and easier to cast into complex shapes. Bronze could be made into tools that held their edge, weapons that didn't bend in battle, and intricate decorative objects that displayed wealth and artistic skill. The discovery of bronze working, which happened independently in several different regions around 3000 BCE, fundamentally changed human societies. Agricultural communities could clear forests more efficiently with bronze axes. Armies equipped with bronze weapons had enormous advantages over those still using stone or pure copper. Elites could commission elaborate bronze vessels and jewellery to display their status. But here's the catch. Bronze required two different metals, and those metals weren't always found in the same places. Copper was relatively abundant. The island of Cyprus was so rich in copper that its very name comes from the metal. There were copper mines in Anatolia, in Sardinia, in Sinai, in the mountains of Oman, but tin was a different story. Tin deposits are rare in nature, and the ones that existed in the Bronze Age world were scattered across huge distances. Archaeological and isotopic studies suggest that tin came from sources as far-flung as Cornwall and Devon in Britain, Brittany and France, the Ore Mountains between Germany and the Czech Republic, and deposits in Central Asia, possibly modern Afghanistan or Uzbekistan. Think about what this means. A bronze smith in Mycenae, hammering out a new sword, was using copper that might have come from Cyprus, only a few hundred miles away. But the tin in that bronze might have travelled over 2,000 miles, passing through countless hands, crossing mountains and deserts and seas. The sword was a physical manifestation of a global trade network. This created what we might call resource dependency. Civilizations that wanted bronze, and in the Bronze Age, every civilization wanted bronze, had to maintain access to distant sources of tin. This wasn't optional. Tin couldn't be substituted. If the supply was interrupted, if the trade routes were severed, the bronze industry would grind to a halt. And in a world where military supremacy depended on bronze weapons and agricultural productivity depended on bronze tools, that meant existential vulnerability. The trade networks that supplied bronze also carried everything else: grain, wine, olive oil, textiles, timber, precious metals, luxury goods. Ships and caravans moved constantly along established routes. Merchant communities grew up at key ports and crossroads. Entire cities existed primarily as trading entrepôts, places where goods from one region were exchanged for goods from another. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was one of these crucial nodes. Positioned at the western end of overland routes from Mesopotamia and the eastern end of sea routes from the Aegean, Ugarit was a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from a dozen different cultures mingled in the marketplace. The city's archives preserve records of trade in copper, tin, grain, timber, textiles, and luxury items. Ugarit had its own fleet of merchant ships and maintained diplomatic relations with all the major powers. But this prosperity was also fragility. Ugarit depended utterly on the continuation of trade. Its population, swollen by commerce, needed imported grain to eat. Its wealth came from being a crucial link in the chain. If that chain broke, Ugarit's entire reason for existence vanished. And this was true to varying degrees for all the late Bronze Age civilizations. They had built a world of interdependence, of specialization, of intricate economic connections. This gave them unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement. But it also meant that a disruption in one place could cascade throughout the entire system. Like a house of cards, the structure was magnificent, but its complexity made it vulnerable. The very thing that made the Bronze Age world so successful, its interconnectedness, would become its fatal weakness. And then, into this carefully balanced world, came the Sea Peoples. or at least that's how the traditional narrative goes. The story of the Sea Peoples has captured imaginations for over a century, and for good reason. They appear in ancient texts as mysterious raiders from the sea, destroying cities and toppling empires. Egyptian inscriptions describe massive battles against these invaders. For decades, they were cast as the primary villains of the Bronze Age collapse, the barbarians who brought down civilization. But the reality is far more complex and far more mysterious. The term Sea Peoples is actually a modern invention, coined by French Egyptologists in the 1800s, based on Egyptian records that referred to peoples of the sea, or peoples from the islands. The ancient Egyptians never used a single collective name for these groups. Instead, they listed several different peoples, each with their own designation. We have records of two major Egyptian campaigns against groups that we now call Sea Peoples. The first was during the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah around 1207 BCE. Egyptian inscriptions describe an invasion of the Nile Delta by a coalition that included Libyans and several seaborne peoples: the Sherdan, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Teresh, and the Ekwesh. Meneptah's forces defeated them, and the pharaoh had inscriptions carved celebrating his victory. 30 years later, around 1177 BCE, another wave of Sea Peoples attacked Egypt, this time during the reign of Rameses III. The reliefs carved on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu show us some of the most detailed images we have of these invaders. We see naval battles, with Egyptian ships ramming vessels filled with warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses. We see land battles, with ox carts carrying women and children, suggesting this wasn't just a raid but a migration. The inscriptions list the groups involved: the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, and the Sherdan. Rameses III claimed total victory. The temple reliefs show piles of enemy dead, prisoners being led away, and ships being captured. The inscriptions boast of how the pharaoh saved Egypt from destruction. And this was probably true. Egypt did survive, but the cost was staggering. The campaigns against the Sea Peoples drained the Egyptian treasury. Rameses had to pay and supply his armies, repair damaged infrastructure, and deal with the disruption to trade. Not long after this victory, the workers building the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina went on strike because they hadn't been paid. This was the first recorded labour strike in history, and it was a sign of how much the wars had weakened Egypt economically. But who were these Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? And where did they go after the Egyptians defeated them? These questions have no certain answers, and that uncertainty has fueled speculation for over a century. The Egyptian sources only tell us that they came from the sea, or the islands. They don't specify which islands or which seas. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show us visual details: distinctive feathered headdresses on some warriors, horned helmets on others, round shields, long swords, and ships with bird-headed prows. But these images don't reveal origins. Based on the names of the various groups, historians have made educated guesses, attempting to match the Egyptian names with known peoples or places from the Bronze Age world. The Peliset are usually identified with the later Philistines who settled in Canaan. The biblical accounts describe the Philistines as coming from Kafta, which many scholars believe refers to Crete or the broader Aegean region. The Philistines established 5 major cities along the coast of what's now Israel and the Gaza Strip: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Archaeological evidence from these sites shows cultural connections to the Aegean world, with pottery styles and architectural features that suggest origins somewhere in that region. The Sherdan might be connected to Sardinia, though whether they originated there or settled there after their conflicts with Egypt is debated. The name is tantalizingly similar, but similarity alone doesn't prove connection. The Shekelesh are possibly linked to Sicily, again based primarily on the similarity of names. The Luka are the clearest case. They're almost certainly from Lycia, a region in southwestern Anatolia that's mentioned in Hittite texts as a source of both allies and problems. The Jekka might have come from somewhere in the Aegean, possibly Crete. They settled at the port city of Dora on the Levantine coast after their defeat by Egypt. a document called the Tale of Wenamun, written about a century after the Sea People's invasions, describes Dor as a Chequer city. The Teresh have been speculatively linked to the Tyrrhenians, who gave their name to the Tyrrhenian Sea west of Italy, and were possibly the ancestors of the Etruscans. But this connection is far from certain. The Denian might be connected to the Danans, one of the names Homer uses for the Greeks. If so, they could have come from mainland Greece or the Aegean Islands. The Eqesh have been tentatively identified with the Achaeans, another Homeric name for the Greeks. The Weshesh are the most mysterious. They appear only in documents from the reign of Rameses III, and we have no visual representations of them or any clues to their origins. But these are all tentative connections, based on linguistic similarities that might be coincidental, and scholars still debate them vigorously. Some researchers believe the Sea Peoples originated in the Western Mediterranean and moved eastward. This theory suggests they might have fled disruptions in Italy, Sicily or Sardinia, sailing east in search of new lands. Others think they came from the Aegean or Anatolia and were heading west when they attacked Egypt. The reliefs show them approaching Egypt from the north and northeast, which suggests they came through the Levant. Still others propose that they were a mixed group, drawing from multiple regions, united more by circumstance than by common origin. A confederation of displaced peoples, speaking different languages, coming from different places, but all fleeing the same general catastrophe that was destroying the Bronze Age world. Here's where our understanding has shifted dramatically in recent decades. The older view was that the Sea Peoples were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were portrayed as fierce warriors who swept through the Eastern Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path, and only Egypt managed to stop them. But modern archaeologists increasingly see them not as cause, but as symptom. The Sea Peoples, according to this view, were refugees. They were displaced populations, fleeing from the same catastrophes that were destroying the civilizations of the Late Bronze Age. Drought, famine, earthquake, political collapse. These things would have created massive numbers of refugees, desperate people searching for new lands and new opportunities. Some of these refugees would have turned to raiding and piracy out of necessity. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show something telling. Along with the warriors, we see ox carts loaded with women, children, and household goods. This doesn't look like a purely military invasion. It looks like migration. Whole communities on the move, fighting when necessary to find new homes. Several of the Sea Peoples groups appear to have settled in the Levant after their defeats by Egypt. The Peliset, the Philistines, established cities along the coast of what's now Israel and the Gaza Strip. The Chequer settled at the port city of Dor. These weren't conquerors imposing their rule on existing populations. They were newcomers, integrating into a landscape that was itself in turmoil. So the Sea Peoples weren't the villains who destroyed civilization. They were among the victims, driven from their homelands by forces we're still trying to understand. Their attacks on Egypt were acts of desperation, not conquest. And while those attacks certainly contributed to Egypt's decline, they weren't the root cause of the wider collapse. To find that cause, we need to look deeper. Because while the Sea Peoples were besieging Egypt's borders, the entire Eastern Mediterranean was being hit by a series of overlapping catastrophes. Natural disasters and climate shifts that would have challenged even a healthy, stable civilization. For the already stressed societies of the Late Bronze Age, they proved overwhelming. Let's start with drought. For the past few decades, scientists have been piecing together the climate history of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean using various forms of evidence. They've analysed pollen, samples from lake beds, which show what kinds of plants were growing in different periods. They've studied sediment cores from the ocean floor. They've examined tree rings, which record year-by-year variations in rainfall. They've looked at archaeological evidence of changes in settlement patterns and agricultural practices. What this research reveals is sobering. Beginning around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged period of drought. This wasn't a few dry years. This was a mega-drought, a climatic shift that persisted for roughly 300 years, from about 1200 to 900 BCE. The pollen evidence shows a dramatic change in vegetation. In the period before 1200 BCE, pollen samples from the region show abundant tree pollen, and pollen from plants that thrive in wetter conditions. After 1200 BCE, tree pollen declines sharply and is replaced by pollen from scrub plants and grasses adapted to drier conditions. This indicates that the landscape was becoming more arid, that forests were giving way to something closer to Mediterranean scrubland. The timing is striking. The drought intensified right around the time when the late Bronze Age civilizations began to collapse, and the effects would have been catastrophic for agricultural societies. Rainfall patterns shifted. Areas that had been dependable breadbaskets became marginal. Crops failed. Springs and streams that communities depended on dried up. The great civilizations could endure a few bad years. They had grain storage systems, administrative mechanisms for redistributing food, and trade networks to import supplies from better-off regions. But a drought lasting decades, even centuries, would have overwhelmed these coping mechanisms. Harvests would fail repeatedly, stored grain would run out, the population would face chronic food shortages. In Egypt, which depended on the Nile's annual flood, the drought seems to have reduced the river's flow. Records from the time mention concerns about low Nile floods, which meant less water for irrigation and smaller harvests. Egypt survived better than most because the Nile is fed by rains in the Ethiopian highlands, which were somewhat buffered from the Mediterranean drought. But even Egypt felt the strain. For civilizations in Anatolia, the Levant and Greece, the situation was far worse. These regions depended directly on local rainfall for their agriculture. When the rains failed year after year, the consequences were immediate and severe. Famine would have stalked the land. Populations would have been forced to migrate, abandoning villages that could no longer support them, moving toward regions that seemed to have better conditions. This is exactly what the archaeological record shows, a pattern of site abandonment, population movement, and demographic collapse. But drought wasn't the only natural disaster hammering the Bronze Age world. There were also earthquakes, lots of earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on active tectonic boundaries. The African plate is pushing northward against the Eurasian plate, creating a zone of intense seismic activity that runs through Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Earthquakes are common in this region even today. In the Bronze Age, they would have been equally frequent, but there's evidence that something unusual happened around 1200 BCE. Geophysicists studying the seismic history of the region have identified what they call an earthquake storm, a period when major earthquakes struck in rapid succession across a wide area. Between roughly 1225 and 1175 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean seems to have experienced an unusually intense period of seismic activity. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources. At many Bronze Age sites, archaeologists have found evidence of earthquake damage. Collapsed walls, tilted buildings, crushed human remains found in positions, suggesting they were trapped when structures fell. At Mycenae, for instance, excavations revealed signs that the city was struck by a major earthquake around 1250 BCE. Buildings collapsed, walls toppled, and parts of the city were simply abandoned. The site was partially rebuilt but never fully recovered before a final destruction by fire around 1190 BCE. At Tiryns, another major Mycenaean centre, earthquake damage dating to around 1200 BCE has been documented. Similar evidence has been found at Troy, at various Hittite sites in Anatolia, and at cities in the Levant. The pattern is clear. A wave of major earthquakes rolled across the region right at the time when the civilizations were collapsing. Now, civilizations can rebuild after earthquakes. The Minoan civilization on Crete was devastated by a massive earthquake and volcanic eruption around 1700 BCE, but it recovered and thrived for another 3 centuries. What made the Late Bronze Age different was that the earthquakes hit societies that were already under severe stress from drought and famine. Imagine a city dealing with food shortages, with refugees streaming in from rural areas where crops have failed, with trade disrupted because merchant ships aren't arriving. Now add a major earthquake that destroys public buildings, damages defensive walls, and kills a portion of the population. The compounding effect would be devastating. Resources that might have gone to dealing with the famine now had to be diverted to earthquake recovery. populations already at the edge of survival were pushed over, and because the earthquake storm lasted decades, striking different regions at different times, there was no period of stability in which to recover. What about disease? This is harder to track because ancient pathogens don't leave clear archaeological evidence. But it's worth noting that famine and population displacement create ideal conditions for epidemic disease. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Crowding facilitates transmission. The breakdown of sanitation infrastructure in damaged cities creates health hazards. Some scholars have speculated that plague or other epidemic diseases might have swept through the Bronze Age world during this period, though direct evidence is lacking. What we're seeing is a cascade of overlapping disasters. Drought created famine, which caused population movements and stressed political systems. Earthquakes damaged cities and disrupted recovery efforts. Possible epidemics killed already weakened populations. And all of this was happening simultaneously across a region that depended on interconnected trade and stable political relationships. The trade networks began to fail. Ships couldn't sail if ports were damaged by earthquakes, or if there was no cargo to carry because harvests had failed. Merchants couldn't operate in regions destabilized by famine refugees or military campaigns. The tin supply from distant sources was disrupted, making bronze production difficult. Agricultural surpluses disappeared, meaning cities could no longer feed non-farming populations of craftsmen, scribes, and soldiers. Everything that had made the Bronze Age world prosperous was breaking down at once, and when the disasters hit, the complex palace economies proved unable to adapt. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, succumbed to the chaos. Let's trace what happened to some of the major civilizations. The Hittite Empire is perhaps the most dramatic case. At its height in the 13th century BCE, the Hittite state was one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world. Its territory covered most of Anatolia and parts of northern Syria. Its capital, Hattusa, was an imposing fortress city built among rocky hills, with massive stone walls, grand temples, and royal palaces. The Hittite kings corresponded as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt. Hittite armies had fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in history, and then around 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire simply vanished. Hattusa was abandoned. The great temples were left empty. The archives fell silent. For decades, archaeologists debated what happened. The city shows evidence of destruction by fire, with burn layers found in excavations. But who destroyed it? Invaders? Internal revolt? The evidence is ambiguous. What's clear is that the Hittite state collapsed completely and suddenly. The capital was never reoccupied. The empire fragmented into small successor kingdoms that retained some cultural memory of the Hittites, but had none of their power or territorial extent. Letters found in the archives at Hattusa, dating to the final years before the collapse, paint a picture of a kingdom under severe stress. There are references to grain shortages, requests for emergency food supplies from neighbouring kingdoms. There are mentions of military threats on multiple borders. The last Hittite king seems to have been desperately trying to hold things together, dealing with crisis after crisis, before the whole system simply gave out. In Greece, the Mycenaean civilization met a similar fate, though the details differ. The great palace centres, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, were destroyed one by one over a period of roughly a century, from about 1250 to 1150 BCE. At Pylos in southwestern Greece, the palace was burned so thoroughly that the clay tablets in its archives were baked hard, accidentally preserving them for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. The tablets from Pylos record the palace's final days. They list preparations for some kind of emergency, military equipment being gathered, coastal watchers being posted, offerings being made to the gods, and then the tablets stop, because the palace burned and the scribes either fled or died. At Mycenae, the evidence shows multiple destructions. An earthquake around 1250 BCE damaged parts of the city. It was rebuilt. Then around 1190 BCE, the palace complex was destroyed by fire. Whether this was warfare, accident, or deliberate burning by departing inhabitants isn't clear. What is clear is that Mycenae, once the wealthiest and most powerful centre in Greece, never recovered. The population shrank, the palace was not rebuilt, the elaborate administrative system disappeared. Greece entered what we call the Greek Dark Age, a period lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE, during which population declined dramatically, settlements were small and scattered, monumental architecture disappeared, and literacy was lost. The Linear B script, used for palace administration, vanished completely. When writing returned to Greece centuries later, it would be in a completely different script. The Greek alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. In the Levant, the destruction was similarly widespread. Ugarit, that prosperous trading city we mentioned earlier, was destroyed around 1185 BCE. The final documents from Ugarit's archives include desperate letters. One, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia in Cyprus, reads in part, "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have set fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are stationed in Hatti, and that all my ships are stationed in Lycia, and have not yet returned? So the country is abandoned to itself." Another letter, apparently never sent, was found in the ruins. When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. These letters tell a story of a city caught unprepared, with its military forces deployed elsewhere, unable to defend against a sudden attack. After its destruction, Ugarit was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned, and eventually sand covered the ruins. Other major cities in the Levant met similar fates. Megiddo, an important strategic site controlling inland routes, was destroyed. Hazor, the largest city in Canaan, was burned. Sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries were suddenly abandoned. Egypt survived, but in a much weakened state. The wars against the Sea Peoples had drained the treasury. The disruption of trade meant that luxury goods and raw materials stopped flowing into Egypt. The grand building projects of the New Kingdom pharaohs came to an end. Egypt would continue as a civilization, but it never again achieved the power and prosperity it had known in the Late Bronze Age. The pattern across the eastern Mediterranean was the same. The complex palace-based states collapsed. Literacy was lost or greatly reduced. Populations declined and dispersed. Long-distance trade ceased, and monumental architecture stopped. In its place came smaller, simpler societies, often based around fortified hilltop settlements rather than lowland palaces. The archaeological term for what followed is simply Dark Age, a period from which we have far fewer artifacts, no written records, and evidence of a much lower level of material culture. So what really caused this catastrophe? Why did the entire Bronze Age system collapse? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain, and perhaps more importantly, there probably isn't a single answer. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't like the fall of Rome, which can be traced to specific political and military developments. It was a systems collapse, a failure of complexity itself. Modern scholars increasingly favour what's called the perfect storm theory, first articulated by archaeologist Eric Klein. This theory argues that no single factor was sufficient to bring down the Bronze Age civilizations. Each of these societies had faced droughts before, had endured earthquakes, had survived military defeats. But they had never faced all of these challenges simultaneously. The key insight is about timing and interconnection. The mega-drought created chronic food shortages throughout the region. This led to famines, population displacement, and political instability. At the same time, the earthquake storm was damaging cities and infrastructure, making it harder to respond to the famine. Meanwhile, the disruption of agriculture and the movement of refugees was interfering with trade networks, cutting off the supply of essential materials like tin. As trade collapsed, the palace economies that depended on controlling and redistributing goods began to fail. This created economic crisis, which led to inability to pay soldiers and administrators, which caused further political breakdown. The Sea Peoples, themselves refugees from regions being devastated by these same factors, added additional military and demographic pressure on societies already at the breaking point. It's not that any one of these factors was catastrophic. It's that they all happened at once, and they amplified each other. The complexity that had made the Bronze Age world so prosperous became its vulnerability. The interdependence meant that collapse in one region cascaded into other regions. When Hittite grain supplies failed, they couldn't send food to Ugarit, so Ugarit starved. When Syrian ports were destroyed, the trade routes to Cyprus and the Aegean were disrupted, so Mycenaean palaces lost their overseas contacts. When tin supplies from distant sources were cut off, bronze production everywhere suffered, meaning armies couldn't maintain their equipment, which made kingdoms vulnerable to attack. The very specialization and trade that had created wealth now created fragility. There's another factor that deserves mention: the rigidity of the palace economies themselves. The Bronze Age kingdoms were highly centralized. Power, resources, and decision-making were concentrated in the palaces. The administrative apparatus, with its scribes and overseers and complex record-keeping, was designed to manage a functioning economy, not to adapt to catastrophic change. When the crises hit, these systems couldn't adjust. The palaces tried to maintain control, tried to manage the economy as they always had, but the economy had fundamentally changed. There was no grain surplus to redistribute. There were no luxury goods to trade. The tax base was collapsing as agricultural land was abandoned, and the palace bureaucracies, rather than adapting, simply kept trying to do what they'd always done until the whole structure collapsed. Some scholars have drawn comparisons to modern concepts of resilience and brittleness in complex systems. The Bronze Age societies had optimized for efficiency, creating elaborate systems for managing resources and trade. But this optimization made them brittle. They could handle normal stresses, but when hit by multiple unprecedented shocks, they shattered rather than bent. Simpler societies, with less interdependence and less centralization, were actually more resilient. They didn't fall as far because they weren't as elevated to begin with, and in the aftermath, it was often these simpler societies, or new groups emerging from the ruins, that adapted and eventually thrived. We should also note that the collapse wasn't uniform. Some regions were hit harder than others. Egypt and Assyria both survived, though weakened. Cyprus had some sites that were destroyed, but others that continued and even flourished. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast, including Tyre and Sidon, managed to maintain their maritime trade traditions and would eventually emerge as the dominant seafaring culture of the Iron Age. Why did some survive while others perished? Geography played a role. Egypt's access to Nile water made it less vulnerable to the drought. Assyria's more inland position may have shielded it from some of the Sea People's raids, but adaptation mattered too. Societies that could decentralize, that could shift from palace economies to more distributed systems, had better chances. The Phoenicians, for instance, seem to have moved toward merchant-based rather than palace-based trade, which made them more flexible. The ones that couldn't adapt, that tried to maintain the old systems until the bitter end, were the ones that collapsed most completely. And so the world entered darkness. The term Dark Age is sometimes criticised by historians who feel it's too dramatic, but it's hard to find a better description for what happened. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, the centuries from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE saw dramatic cultural regression. Population levels plummeted. Archaeological surveys in Greece, for instance, show that the number of occupied sites dropped by as much as 90% in some regions. The large palace centres were gone, replaced by small scattered villages and fortified hilltop settlements. The population may have declined from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands across the Aegean world. Writing systems disappeared. In Greece, as we've mentioned, Linear B was completely lost and wasn't replaced by alphabetic writing until centuries later. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it meant the loss of records, of history, of administrative continuity. When writing returned, there was no memory of what had come before. The Greeks of the 8th century BCE, the time of Homer, had myths and legends about the Mycenaean age, but they had no written records, no clear historical knowledge. Troy and Agamemnon and the Trojan War became the stuff of epic poetry, not history. Monumental architecture ceased. No one was building palaces or great temples anymore. The construction techniques that had created the massive stone walls of Mycenae and Tiryns were forgotten. Later Greeks, looking at these ruins, couldn't believe humans had built them and attributed the walls to the Cyclopes, the mythical one-eyed giants. Long-distance trade collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. The elaborate networks that had carried tin and copper and luxury goods across thousands of miles were gone. Trade became local and limited. The items that were traded were simpler, more utilitarian. Gone were the intricately crafted jewellery and the exotic imports. The economy shifted from bronze to iron. This is why the period following the Bronze Age is called the Iron Age. But this wasn't a triumphant technological advance. Ironworking had been known in the Bronze Age, but iron was inferior to bronze for most purposes. Bronze was easier to work, held a better edge, and looked more impressive. The shift to iron came not because it was better, but because bronze was no longer available. The tin trade had collapsed, making bronze scarce and expensive. Iron ore, in contrast, was common in many regions. It required higher temperatures to smelt, which made it technically more challenging, but it was locally available. The shift to iron was born of necessity, not innovation. Culturally, this was a time of fragmentation and localization. The cosmopolitan world of the Bronze Age, where styles and ideas flowed freely across regions, gave way to isolated local cultures. Pottery styles that had been traded and imitated across the Mediterranean became purely local. Artistic traditions simplified. The elaborate frescoes of Mycenaean palaces were replaced by geometric designs on pots. The change is stark when you compare artifacts from 1250 BCE with those from 1050 BCE. The earlier period shows wealth, craftsmanship, variety, connections to distant places. The later period shows poverty, simplicity, isolation. And yet this darkness wasn't total. Some regions maintained threads of continuity. Some innovations emerged from the chaos. The alphabet, that revolutionary technology that would eventually transform literacy, developed during this period. The Phoenicians, building on earlier writing systems, created a simplified alphabetic script that was far easier to learn than the complex syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age. This alphabet would eventually spread to Greece, and from there to the rest of Europe, becoming the ancestor of the script you're reading now. In the Levant, new groups emerged from the disruption. The Philistines, likely descended from some of the Sea Peoples, established cities along the coast. The Israelites emerged as a distinct cultural group in the hill country of Canaan, developing the religious traditions that would eventually become Judaism. In Anatolia, small successor states kept some elements of Hittite culture alive, though nothing like the empire of old, and slowly, over centuries, recovery began. Population levels stabilized and then started to grow. Trade routes were re-established, though on a smaller scale at first. New political structures emerged, different from the palace kingdoms of the Bronze Age. In Greece, this would eventually lead to the development of the city-state system and the cultural flowering of the classical age. In the Near East, new empires would rise, the Neo-Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and eventually the Persians. But these were fundamentally different from their Bronze Age predecessors, built on different political and economic models, informed by the bitter lessons of collapse. Looking back across 3,000 years at the ruins of the Bronze Age world, what can we learn? What do these ancient catastrophes tell us, if anything, about our own time? The first lesson is about the fragility of complex systems. The Bronze Age civilizations weren't primitive. They were sophisticated, technologically advanced for their time, with elaborate administrative structures and far-reaching economic networks. They had survived for centuries, they seemed permanent, and yet they collapsed with shocking speed when hit by multiple simultaneous crises. Modern scholarship has revised many details of the collapse story. Archaeological work over the past few decades has shown that the destruction wasn't quite as universal as once thought. Some sites that were long believed to have been destroyed around 1200 BCE were actually abandoned peacefully, or destroyed at different times. The picture is more complex and more varied than the simple narrative of total catastrophe. But the essential fact remains: A world system that had existed for centuries came apart within a few generations. The interconnectedness that had created prosperity also created vulnerability. When one part of the network failed, the effects cascaded throughout the system. This should sound familiar to modern ears. Our global economy is vastly more interconnected than the Bronze Age trade networks ever were. We depend on supply chains that span the globe. Disruptions in one region can have rapid effects everywhere else, as we've learned from recent events. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that complexity and interdependence, while creating enormous benefits, also create systemic risks. The second lesson is about the importance of resilience and adaptability. The societies that survived the Bronze Age collapse were often not the most powerful or sophisticated, but the most flexible. Those that could adapt their economic and political structures to new circumstances had better chances than those that tried to maintain the old systems until they broke. In our own time, as we face challenges from climate change, resource depletion, and potential technological disruptions, building resilient systems that can adapt to change may be more important than optimizing purely for efficiency. The third lesson is about environmental change. The mega drought that afflicted the Bronze Age world wasn't caused by human activity. It was a natural climate shift, but its effects were catastrophic precisely because human societies had built complex, fragile systems that couldn't cope with sustained environmental stress. As we face human-caused climate change in our own era, the Bronze Age collapse serves as a warning about how climate shifts can interact with social and economic vulnerabilities to produce cascading failures. Of course, we must be careful not to draw simplistic analogies. The modern world is very different from the Bronze Age. We have technologies, knowledge, and global communication that the ancients lacked. We have the ability to see crises coming and coordinate responses on a scale impossible 3,000 years ago. But we also have far more people, far greater environmental pressures, and far more complex dependencies. Whether our advantages outweigh our vulnerabilities is an open question. The Bronze Age collapse also reminds us of human resilience. Yes, civilizations fell. Yes, there was a dark age. But humanity survived. New societies emerged from the ruins. Knowledge was not entirely lost, some was preserved and passed on, some was rediscovered. The alphabet developed during this period would prove more revolutionary than anything the Bronze Age had produced. The cultural and religious traditions that emerged from the collapse would shape the subsequent course of history. The end was not actually the end. It was a transformation, painful and costly, but one that eventually led to new beginnings. For us, sitting in the quiet of the night, contemplating these ancient ruins, perhaps the deepest lesson is about impermanence. The great powers of the Bronze Age thought they would last forever. The palaces seemed permanent, the trade routes seemed eternal, the system seemed unshakable, and then it was gone, swept away by forces that no single person or kingdom could control. Everything built by human hands eventually falls. Every civilization has its day, and then gives way to something else. This isn't a cause for despair. It's simply the nature of time and change. What matters is not permanence, but what we do with the time we have. The Bronze Age civilizations, for all their ultimate collapse, achieved remarkable things. They built cities of beauty. They created art that still moves us. They developed technologies and ideas that echoed through the centuries. They lived, they built, they created, and what they made mattered, even though it didn't last. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the ruins. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse will probably never be completely solved. New archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding. Debates among scholars continue about the relative importance of different factors, about chronologies, about causes and effects. But perhaps the mystery itself is part of the point. We want simple answers, single causes, clear narratives. The truth is usually more complicated. The Bronze Age world fell not to one disaster, but to many. Not to one cause, but to a cascade of interconnected failures. It was a perfect storm, confluence of catastrophes that no one could have predicted or prevented. And in the darkness that followed, humanity persisted, adapted, and eventually rebuilt. New cultures rose from the ashes. New ideas emerged from the chaos. The story didn't end with the collapse, it transformed into something different, something that would eventually lead to the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, and through them to our own world. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind wander through those ancient ruins. Picture the abandoned palaces, the silent trade routes, the forgotten cities slowly being covered by sand and time. Feel the weight of centuries pressing down on those stones, and then remember that you are here now, part of a long chain of human experience that stretches back through the darkness to those Bronze Age kingdoms and forward into a future we cannot see. Sleep well. The ancient world sleeps with you, its stories preserved in the earth, waiting to be discovered, waiting to teach us about resilience and fragility, about the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall, about the eternal cycle of building and collapse and building again that defines the human story. But the story does not end there. What follows is perhaps an even more remarkable chapter, a transformation that would reshape not just one continent but the entire planet. Because the stage we have explored, whether filled with ancient giants or dominated by shifting climates, whether ruled by fierce predators or shaped by geological forces, was merely the prologue. The real odyssey was about to begin, and it would be driven not by the largest animals or the most fearsome hunters, but by one small, adaptable, utterly unremarkable primate that refused to stay in one place. This is the story of the Great Dispersal, the moment when a single species stepped out of familiar territory and walked into the unknown, crossing deserts and oceans, mountains and ice sheets, until there was nowhere left to go. This is the story of how we became everywhere. Around 100,000 years ago, something began to shift in the behaviour of Homo sapiens living in East Africa. The archaeological record shows a subtle but profound change in the material culture, the objects left behind by these early humans. Stone tools became more sophisticated, not just functional, but refined, showing evidence of planning and foresight. Beads appeared, crafted from shells carried from distant coasts, suggesting not just aesthetic awareness but trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometres. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, was being ground into powder and used for purposes we can only guess at: body decoration, ceremonial marking, or symbolic communication. These were not the artifacts of animals simply trying to survive. These were the creations of minds capable of abstraction, of thinking beyond the immediate moment, of imagining possibilities that did not yet exist. The climate at this time was entering a phase of extreme instability. The world was caught in the grip of an ice age, but not a uniform one. The glacial cycles that dominated the Pleistocene were driven by subtle wobbles in Earth's orbit, changes so small that an individual human would never notice them in a lifetime, but powerful enough over millennia to freeze continents or melt polar ice. Africa, sitting astride the equator, did not experience the crushing ice sheets that buried Europe and North America, but it felt the secondary effects. The monsoon rains that watered the Sahel and the Ethiopian highlands weakened. Lakes shrank. Rivers dried to chains of stagnant pools. The grasslands that had supported vast herds of game animals withered, turning to dust. For the humans living there, the world was becoming increasingly hostile, less able to support the growing populations that had thrived during wetter times. This environmental pressure created a crisis, but also an opportunity. Populations faced a choice. They could stay and compete for dwindling resources, fighting over the last waterholes and the last herds, or they could move. For most of human evolutionary history, movement had been limited. Seasonal migrations following game or water, but always returning to familiar territories. But now, some groups made a different decision. They walked toward the horizon and kept walking, crossing into lands where no human foot had trodden before, carrying with them not just their tools and their children, but the accumulated knowledge of generations, the stories of how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, how to survive. The first attempts to leave Africa may have begun as early as 200,000 years ago. Fossils from caves in the Levant the region we now call Israel and Lebanon, show that Homo sapiens reached these areas and lived there intermittently for tens of thousands of years. These were not sustained migrations, but experimental forays, pioneering populations pushing into new territory during favourable climatic windows when the deserts bloomed and the routes north were passable. But these early ventures seem to have failed. The populations either died out or retreated back to Africa when conditions worsened, replaced by Neanderthals moving south from Europe, fleeing the advancing ice sheets of their own glacial nightmare. But humans are persistent creatures. The failures of the past did not erase the impulse to explore, the restlessness that seems wired into our species. Around 70 to 60,000 years ago, during a period when global climates were particularly harsh and northern Africa was locked in megadrought, something remarkable happened. A small group, perhaps numbering fewer than 1,000 individuals, left the Horn of Africa and crossed the narrow strait at Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Grief, where the Red Sea pinches close to the Arabian Peninsula. This was not a planned expedition. They were not explorers seeking glory or adventure. They were refugees, driven by necessity, following the coastline in search of food, exploiting the shellfish beds and tidal pools that required no sophisticated hunting skills, just patience and knowledge of the tides. This crossing, this single event involving perhaps a few hundred people at most, was the genetic bottleneck through which all non-African humanity would pass. Every person living today whose ancestors came from Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas can trace their lineage back to this one small group. They carried with them only a subset of the genetic diversity present in Africa, a sampling of alleles and traits that would become the foundation for all future populations outside the continent. This is why genetic studies consistently show that African populations are the most diverse, harbouring more genetic variation than all other human populations combined. The rest of us are the descendants of a splinter group, a breakaway faction that stumbled into the rest of the world. What they found on the other side of that strait was a landscape utterly unlike the one they had left. The Arabian Peninsula, today a scorching desert of sand and rock, was during this period transformed by the same orbital mechanics that had dried out Africa. The monsoons that had weakened over the Horn had strengthened over Arabia, turning the interior into a patchwork of grasslands dotted with freshwater lakes. Fossil lakes, their dried beds filled with the bones of hippos and water birds, tell us that this region was lush, a corridor of green threading between the mountains and the sea. The humans who arrived here would have found herds of oryx and gazelle, ostriches and wild cattle, a familiar savanna ecosystem transplanted into a foreign land. But this green corridor was temporary, a window that would close as the climate shifted again. The humans who had entered Arabia faced another decision. They could stay and risk being trapped when the rains failed and the desert returned, or they could keep moving, and move they did, following the coast eastward along the shores of the Persian Gulf, which during times of low sea level was not a gulfed, all but a river valley flanked by extensive floodplains. They walked through landscapes that are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water, archaeological sites lost forever beneath the waves, evidence of their passage drowned by the rising seas that came when the ice sheets melted. The coastal route took them into South Asia, reaching India perhaps as early as 70,000 years ago. Stone tools found in the Jureru Valley and other sites show technological signatures consistent with African Middle Stone Age traditions, the toolkit these migrants carried with them. From India, the expansion continued, accelerating along the tropical coasts of Southeast Asia. This was beach combing on a continental scale, a strategy that required little adaptation. The coastline provided a predictable food source, shellfish and crabs, fish trapped in tidal pools, seabirds and their eggs. It was a marginal existence compared to the big game hunting of the African savannas, but it was reliable, and it allowed populations to leapfrog from one coastal ecosystem to the next without having to penetrate the dense, unfamiliar rainforests of the interior. The coastal migration strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Coastlines are linear environments, one-dimensional corridors threading through otherwise hostile terrain. You can walk along a beach for 1,000 kilometers and encounter essentially the same ecosystem, the same food sources, the same dangers, the same survival challenges repeated endlessly. There is no need to learn new skills or develop new technologies. The knowledge that allowed you to survive on one stretch of coast would work just as well on the next. And the coast itself acts as a highway, a natural navigation system that requires no map. Keep the ocean on one side and you cannot get lost. Follow the shore and eventually you will reach somewhere new. Archaeological evidence for this coastal migration is frustratingly sparse, but the reason is obvious. Sea levels at the end of the Pleistocene were 100 to 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastlines where these early humans walked, the beaches where they gathered shellfish, the campsites where they built their fires, all of these are now underwater, submerged beneath the continental shelves. The archaeological sites that would prove the coastal migration hypothesis are drowned, buried under sediments deposited over the last 10,000 years of rising seas. We can only glimpse this lost world through scattered sites that happen to be inland from the ancient coasts, or through rare locations where tectonic uplift has raised ancient shorelines above the modern sea level, preserving them from the flood. But genetics fills in the gaps left by archaeology. The DNA of living populations tells a story of rapid coastal expansion. The genetic diversity of populations decreases as you move east from Africa, a pattern consistent with serial founder effects, where each new population established along the route carried only a subset of the genetic variation from the population that spawned it. This creates a gradient, a genetic trail of breadcrumbs leading from East Africa through Arabia, into India, and on through Southeast Asia to Australia. The molecular clock, the steady accumulation of mutations over time, allows geneticists to estimate when populations split from each other, and these dates align with the archaeological evidence for rapid coastal migration beginning around 70,000 years ago. The humans moving along these coasts were not travelling in a single wave. The migration was a diffusion process, populations expanding into empty territory, growing until they exceeded the carrying capacity of their local environment, and then fissioning, with some groups staying and others moving on. Over generations, this process led to the gradual filling of the coastal corridor, a string of settlements like beads on a necklace, each one separated from the next by a few days' walk. These settlements were not permanent villages. The people were still hunter-gatherers, still mobile, moving seasonally to exploit different resources, but they were tied to the coast, to the reliable abundance of marine foods that allowed them to maintain stable populations in environments where the terrestrial resources were unpredictable or difficult to access. By 60,000 years ago, humans had reached Sundaland, the vast shelf of land that connected the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia into a single continuous landmass during periods of low sea level. And here, for the first time, they encountered a barrier that could not be walked around. Between Sundaland and Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, lay a stretch of open ocean, a gap that even at its narrowest during the lowest sea levels remained at least 90 kilometres wide. There was no visible land on the other side, no smoke from fires or birds flying to and from distant shores to indicate that something lay beyond the horizon. To cross this gap required boats, or at the very least rafts capable of carrying people and supplies across potentially lethal waters patrolled by sharks and swept by unpredictable currents. And yet, they crossed. By 65,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, humans had reached the northern coast of Australia. The evidence is unambiguous. Stone tools, charcoal from hearths, the bones of hunted animals all dated to this extraordinary antiquity. This crossing represents one of the most significant cognitive and technological achievements in human history. It required planning, the construction of watercraft, the ability to navigate out of sight of land, and the courage or desperation to attempt a journey from which there might be no return. Those who made that crossing were the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians and the Papuans, populations that would remain isolated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, developing unique cultures, languages, and genetic adaptations to their island continent. But while some humans were sailing to Australia, others were taking a different path. From the Indian subcontinent, populations began moving north and west, penetrating into Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. This was a far harsher environment than the tropical coasts. These were continental interiors, subject to extreme seasonal variations, baking hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Survival here required different skills, the ability to hunt large terrestrial game, to create clothing and shelter against the cold, to find and exploit seasonal food sources like migrating herds and ripening plant foods. And here, in the highlands and steppes of Western Asia, something extraordinary happened. The migrating Homo sapiens encountered another species of human. The Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving in isolation from the African lineage, adapting to the Ice Age climates of the north. They were robust, heavily muscled, with broad faces and large noses adapted to warm and humidify the frigid air they breathed. Their brains were as large as those of modern humans, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, and possibly even created symbolic art. They were not the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were a successful, intelligent human species that had survived multiple glacial cycles. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met, they did not annihilate each other. They interbred. Genetic analysis of both ancient and modern DNA has revealed that this interbreeding was not a single event, but an extended period of contact and gene flow lasting thousands of years. The descendants of these unions carried genes from both lineages. Today, anyone of non-African descent carries approximately 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA in their genome, genetic fragments inherited from ancestors who lived 50,000 years ago. These fragments are not random. Some Neanderthal genes provided advantages in the new environments Homo sapiens were encountering, genes related to skin pigmentation, allowing for adaptation to lower UV levels at northern latitudes, genes involved in immune response, providing resistance to diseases endemic to Eurasia, and genes affecting metabolism, helping cope with different diets and climates. The meeting between these two human species, separated for more than 500,000 years of independent evolution, must have been extraordinary. Imagine the scene. A band of Homo sapiens, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, families travelling together with children, elders and young hunters, moving through a river valley in the Levant or the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. They are following game, tracking a herd of wild horses or aurochs through unfamiliar territory, and then, across a meadow or from the mouth of a cave, they see others. People, but not quite like themselves. Shorter, more robustly built with brow ridges and receding chins. Faces that look almost but not quite human. The strangers watch them, wary but not fleeing. They carry spears, wear animal skins, and have the bearing of people who know this land, who have lived here for countless generations. What happened in that moment? Was there hostility, a tense standoff with weapons raised? Or was there curiosity, a cautious approach, communication attempted through gestures and vocalizations? We will never know the details, but we know the outcome. These groups did not simply avoid each other or engage in warfare to the exclusion of all else. They interacted, they traded, and eventually they mated. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Homo sapiens and Neanderthal individuals formed relationships intimate enough to produce children, and those hybrid children were viable, capable of growing to adulthood and reproducing in their turn, passing on the mixed genetic heritage to future generations. Recent research has pushed the date of this interbreeding closer to the present than previously thought. Analysis of ancient genomes from Europe and Asia suggests that the main pulse of Neanderthal Homo sapiens interbreeding occurred between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, a relatively narrow window of time. This was not a long period of peaceful coexistence and gradual blending of populations. It was an intense, relatively brief interval of contact as Homo sapiens populations rapidly expanded into territories that had been exclusively Neanderthal domain for hundreds of thousands of years. But the interbreeding was not entirely beneficial. Some Neanderthal genes were deleterious, causing reduced fertility or increased susceptibility to certain diseases. These genes were gradually purged by natural selection over subsequent generations. Interestingly, Neanderthal DNA is not evenly distributed across modern human genomes. There are deserts, regions of the genome where Neanderthal sequences are conspicuously absent, particularly in areas related to brain function and reproduction. This suggests that hybrid incompatibilities existed, genetic mismatches that made it difficult for Neanderthal and Homo sapiens genes to work together harmoniously in certain crucial functions. The X chromosome, one of the sex chromosomes, shows a particularly strong depletion of Neanderthal ancestry. This pattern is consistent with Haldane's rule, a principle in evolutionary biology which states that when hybrids between two species show reduced fitness, it is usually the heterogametic sex, males in mammals, that suffers most. Male hybrids between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have had reduced fertility, causing genes on the X chromosome inherited from Neanderthals to be selected against. Over time, this selection pressure would have removed most Neanderthal sequences from the X chromosome while leaving autosomal chromosomes, the non-sex chromosomes, with a moderate level of Neanderthal ancestry. But where Neanderthal genes were beneficial, they were retained and in some cases increased in frequency through positive selection. One of the most studied examples is the immune system. Neanderthals had lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, exposed to diseases and pathogens that did not exist in Africa. Their immune systems had evolved to recognize and fight these local threats. When Homo sapiens arrived from Africa, they encountered these same pathogens for the first time, and their African evolved immune systems were ill-prepared. The interbreeding with Neanderthals provided an instant upgrade, introducing immune genes that had already been battle-tested against Eurasian diseases. Genes in the major histocompatibility complex, a region of the genome crucial for immune function, show strong signals of adaptive introgression from Neanderthals. Some of these genes are found in high frequencies in modern populations, much higher than would be expected if they were simply drifting neutrally. This is positive selection in action, natural selection favouring individuals who carried these Neanderthal immune variants because they survived infections that killed others. In a very real sense, Neanderthal genes helped Homo sapiens survive in Europe and Asia, providing a genetic shield against invisible killers that our African ancestors had never encountered. Other Neanderthal genes affected physical traits. Skin and hair colour genes inherited from Neanderthals likely helped modern humans adapt to the lower UV radiation levels at northern latitudes. In Africa, dark skin is advantageous, protecting against intense sunlight and reducing the risk of skin cancer, while still allowing sufficient vitamin D production. But at higher latitudes, where sunlight is weaker and arrives at a lower angle, dark skin can be a disadvantage, blocking too much UV and leading to vitamin D deficiency. Lighter skin, produced by variants in genes like SLC24A5 and TLC45A2, allows more UV penetration, increasing vitamin D synthesis. Some of these light skin alleles appear to have been inherited from Neanderthals, providing a shortcut to adaptation that would have otherwise taken thousands of years of natural selection to achieve. Genes affecting hair texture, the shape of teeth, and even pain tolerance have been linked to Neanderthal ancestry. A variant in a gene called SCN9A, which affects pain perception, is more common in people with higher Neanderthal ancestry. People carrying this variant report feeling pain more intensely, particularly in response to skin damage. Why this gene was beneficial to Neanderthals or why it has been retained in modern populations is still unclear. It may be a neutral variant, carried along because it happens to sit next to other genes that were under selection, or it may have had benefits that we do not yet understand, perhaps related to detecting environmental dangers or tissue damage in cold climates where numbness could lead to frostbite. The interbreeding also had unexpected modern consequences. Some Neanderthal gene variants have been linked to increased risk of certain diseases in modern populations, including type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, and even depression. These associations are complex and not fully understood. A gene that was beneficial in the Pleistocene environment, helping Neanderthals store fat during times of scarcity or modulate immune responses to specific pathogens, might be maladaptive in modern environments with abundant food and different disease burdens. The mismatch between the environment in which these genes evolved and the environment in which we live today can turn former advantages into liabilities. In Asia, Homo sapiens encountered yet another human species, the Denisovans, known from only a handful of fossils, a finger bone, a few teeth, and a jawbone, but whose genetic legacy is written in the DNA of modern populations. Denisovans were closely related to Neanderthals, sharing a common ancestor around 400,000 years ago, but they had diverged into a separate lineage, spreading across Asia while the Neanderthals moved west into Europe. The interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Denisovans occurred later than the Neanderthal admixture, after modern humans already carried Neanderthal genes. Today, people of Melanesian descent, inhabiting Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands, carry the highest levels of Denisovan DNA, up to 6% of their genome. This Denisovan genetic legacy is not just a historical curiosity, it had functional consequences. One of the most striking examples is the EPAS1 gene variant, found in Tibetan populations, which allows them to live at high altitudes without suffering from altitude sickness. This gene appears to have been inherited from Denisovans, who themselves had adapted to life in the high plateaus and mountains of Central Asia. When Homo sapiens populations moved into Tibet and the Himalayas, they interbred with Denisovans and inherited this adaptive advantage, allowing them to colonize one of the harshest environments on Earth. The picture that emerges from the genetic and archaeological evidence is not one of a single, simple migration, but a complex braided stream of populations moving, mixing, splitting, and sometimes disappearing. Early waves of Homo sapiens left Africa, encountered other human species, interbred, and in some cases died out without leaving descendants in modern populations. Later waves followed, sometimes replacing earlier populations, sometimes absorbing them. The genetic landscape of Eurasia during the late Pleistocene was a patchwork of different human lineages, all related, all capable of interbreeding, but each carrying unique genetic signatures shaped by their particular histories and environments. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens populations began penetrating into Europe in significant numbers. Europe at this time was Neanderthal territory. They had lived there for 250,000 years, weathering multiple glacial and interglacial cycles. But when modern humans arrived, bringing with them more sophisticated tool technologies, more complex social organizations, and possibly advantages in communication and planning, the balance shifted. Within 10,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. The last known Neanderthal populations clung to refugia in southern Spain and Gibraltar until around 40,000 years ago, and then they vanished from the fossil record. The cause of Neanderthal extinction is still debated. It was likely not simple replacement through violence, though conflicts certainly occurred. Competition for resources in an environment of shrinking territories as glaciers advanced probably played a role. Neanderthal populations were small and fragmented, making them vulnerable to stochastic events like disease or local environmental disasters. And the interbreeding with Homo sapiens, while it allowed some Neanderthal genes to survive, may have contributed to the demographic swamping of distinct Neanderthal populations, their genetic identity diluted and absorbed into the larger, more numerous modern human populations. As humans spread into Europe, they brought with them an explosion of cultural innovation. The Upper Paleolithic, beginning around 40,000 years ago, saw the appearance of representational art, cave paintings and carved figurines depicting animals, humans and abstract symbols. Musical instruments, flutes carved from bone, have been found in caves in Germany, showing that these people created not just visual art but auditory experiences, music and rhythm. Elaborate burials, with bodies adorned with shell beads and ochre, grave goods like tools and ivory carvings placed alongside the dead, suggest belief systems concerning an afterlife or the status of individuals within their communities. This cultural fluorescence was not limited to Europe. Similar innovations appear in Africa and Asia around the same time, suggesting that the cognitive capabilities underlying symbolic thought and complex culture were pan-human, emerging independently in different populations or spreading through cultural exchange as populations remained in contact through trade and migration. The human species had crossed a threshold, moving from beings who could make tools and control fire to beings who could create meaning, who could externalize their inner mental worlds through art and symbol, who could pass down knowledge not just through demonstration but through stories and songs. But even as humans flourished in the old world, the greatest challenges and the most extraordinary journeys still lay ahead. The Americas and the remote islands of the Pacific remained unpopulated by humans. These final frontiers would require not just walking, but navigating open oceans and crossing frozen wastelands, pushing the limits of human endurance and ingenuity to their breaking point. The route into the Americas was blocked for much of the late Pleistocene by an insurmountable barrier: the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, vast glaciers that covered all of Canada and extended south into what is now the northern United States. But around 16 to 15,000 years ago, as the climate began to warm and the Ice Age loosened its grip, corridors began to open. One ran along the western coast of North America, between the retreating glaciers and the Pacific Ocean. Another was an interior route between the two major ice sheets. Exactly which route the first Americans took, or whether they used both, remains uncertain, but archaeological evidence makes clear that by 15,000 years ago, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, a distance of more than 15,000 kilometers from Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska during times of the low sea level. The speed of this expansion is breathtaking. To travel from Alaska to Patagonia in just a few thousand years required not just mobility, but incredible adaptability. The migrants passed through every climate zone on Earth, from Arctic tundra to temperate forests, from high mountain plateaus to tropical rainforests, from deserts to wetlands. Each environment required different survival strategies, different technologies, different knowledge, and unlike the gradual expansions across the Old World, which took place over tens of thousands of years, allowing time for biological and cultural adaptation, the colonization of the Americas was rapid, almost explosive. These people were not slowly evolving to fit new niches. They were using culture, knowledge, and technology to make themselves fit, creating the tools and strategies needed to survive wherever they found themselves. The Americas they entered were a megafaunal paradise, a land of giants unlike anything that exists today. Mammoths and mastodons, relatives of modern elephants but covered in thick woolly coats, roamed in vast herds across the grasslands and forests. Ground sloths, some species weighing several tons and standing as tall as a giraffe when rearing on their hind legs, browsed from trees and stripped vegetation with massive claws. Glyptodonts, armoured mammals the size of small cars with domed shells and spiked tails, grazed on grasses like oversized armadillos. Giant beavers, as large as modern black bears, built dams and lodges in the rivers of North America. Short-faced bears, towering predators with long legs built for running, hunted across the open plains. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions and scimitar cats formed a guild of predators as diverse and dangerous as anything that existed in prehistoric Africa. The arrival of humans in the Americas coincided with a massive extinction event. The megafauna, the giant mammals that had dominated the continents for millions of years, began to disappear. Mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths the size of elephants, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, all vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival. The cause of this extinction is hotly debated. Climate change was certainly occurring. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic shifts in vegetation and rainfall patterns. But the timing is suspicious. The extinctions followed the wave of human expansion from north to south, and the pattern is consistent with overkill, human hunting pressure on naive populations of large animals that had never encountered human predators before. The overkill hypothesis, first proposed by paleontologist Paul Martin in the 1960s, argues that human hunters, armed with effective weapons and cooperative hunting strategies, could drive prey species to extinction within centuries. The megafauna of the Americas, having evolved in the absence of human predators, would have lacked the behavioural adaptations that African and Eurasian megafauna had developed over millions of years of coexistence with hominins. An African elephant that sees a human knows to be wary, to keep its distance to protect its young. This wariness is not instinctive but learned, passed down through generations, a cultural knowledge maintained in elephant societies through teaching and memory. But an American mammoth had never seen a human. It would have had no reason to flee, no understanding that these small bipedal creatures were dangerous. The first encounter might have been curious rather than fearful, and by the time the mammoths learned to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations were too small, too fragmented to recover. The archaeological evidence for overkill is mixed. Kill sites, locations where human hunters butchered megafauna, are relatively rare. The most famous is the Clovis culture, named after a distinctive style of stone projectile point found across North America, dating to between 13,000 and 13,500 years ago. Clovis points are beautifully made, fluted spear tips that fit securely into wooden shafts and could be thrust or thrown with considerable force. At several sites, Clovis points have been found embedded in mammoth bones or lying among the scattered remains of butchered animals, clear evidence that humans were hunting these giants. But whether hunting alone could drive extinctions is debated. Computer models of megafaunal population dynamics suggest that even low levels of hunting, taking only a small percentage of the population each year, could be enough to tip slowly reproducing species into terminal decline. Mammoths, like modern elephants, had long generation times, taking decades to reach sexual maturity and giving birth to a single calf after a gestation period of nearly 2 years. If human hunters preferentially targeted juveniles and young adults, the easiest and least dangerous prey, they could have disrupted the age structure of mammoth populations, removing the individuals who would have been the breeders of the next generation. Even a small reduction in recruitment, the number of young reaching adulthood each year, sustained over decades, would have compounded into population collapse. Other researchers point to climate change as the primary driver, with human hunting playing a secondary role. The end of the Pleistocene brought rapid warming, causing vegetation zones to shift. The mammoth steppe, a unique ecosystem of cold-adapted grasses that supported vast herds of megaherbivores, began to fragment and disappear, replaced by forests in some areas and tundra or desert in others. As the habitat shrank, megafaunal populations declined simply due to loss of food and living space. Humans may have delivered the final blow, pushing already stressed populations over the edge, but the underlying cause was environmental change beyond any one species' control. The truth is probably a combination of both factors. Climate change and human hunting acted synergistically, each amplifying the effects of the other. A population stressed by habitat loss is more vulnerable to hunting pressure. Conversely, a population already reduced by hunting has less genetic diversity and less ability to adapt to changing environments. Together, these pressures created a perfect storm of extinction that swept across the Americas, removing almost all of the megafauna within a geological instant. Within a remarkably short time, the megafauna were gone and the Americas were transformed. The ecosystems that had been shaped by these giant herbivores and the predators that hunted them collapsed and reorganized. Grasslands that had been maintained by mammoth grazing became forests. Seed dispersal systems that had relied on mastodons eating fruits and defecating the seeds miles away broke down, causing some plant species to decline or shift their ranges. The removal of the megafauna was not just a loss of charismatic species, it was a fundamental restructuring of the ecological order, and humans, whether intentionally or not, were the primary architects of that change. While the Americas were being settled, another extraordinary chapter of human expansion was unfolding in the Pacific. The islands of Oceania, scattered across millions of square kilometres of open ocean, represented a challenge unlike any humans had faced before. The Australian continent and New Guinea had been reached tens of thousands of years earlier by short ocean crossings from Southeast Asia. But the islands of Polynesia, Micronesia and Melanesia lay thousands of kilometres from the nearest land masses, separated by vast stretches of water with no intervening islands, no visible landmarks, and no guarantee that land existed at all in the direction one was sailing. The settlement of the Pacific required sophisticated maritime technology. The Austronesian peoples, originating from Taiwan and the Philippines around 5,000 years ago, developed outrigger canoes capable of long-distance voyaging, double-hulled vessels that could carry families, supplies, and even livestock across open ocean. They became master navigators, reading the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds, and the colour of the water to find their way across the trackless sea. They carried with them a package of crops, taro, yams, breadfruit and animals, pigs, chickens and dogs, creating portable ecosystems that could be established on uninhabited islands. The navigation techniques these voyagers developed were extraordinary, a complex body of knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in chants, stories, and practical training that began in childhood. Polynesian navigators learned to read the ocean as if it were a book. The swells, the long rolling waves generated by distant weather systems moved in consistent patterns that could be used to maintain a bearing, even when stars were obscured by clouds. By lying in the bottom of the canoe and feeling the rocking motion, an experienced navigator could distinguish between different swell systems, identifying the direction from which each came and using them as a compass that never failed. The stars provided directional information, but not in the same way they are used in Western navigation. Polynesian navigators did not calculate latitude or use instruments to measure angles. Instead, they memorized star paths, the rising and setting points of specific stars throughout the year, creating a celestial map that covered the entire horizon. By knowing which stars rose directly over specific islands, they could aim for that star's rising point and know they were on the correct bearing. The system was flexible and robust, working even when storms blew them off course because they could recalculate their position based on the stars they could see and adjust their heading accordingly. Birds were living signposts. Certain seabirds, like the white tern and the frigate bird, travel long distances from land to feed, but return to their nesting sites every evening. By observing the direction birds were flying in the late afternoon, navigators could infer the direction to land, even if that land was below the horizon and invisible. The distance could be estimated based on the type of bird. Some species ranged only 30 or 40 kilometres from shore. Others could travel over 100 kilometres. By knowing the behaviour of each species, navigators could gauge how far they were from land and adjust their course. The colour and behaviour of the water also provided clues. Shallow water over submerged reefs appeared lighter, a pale turquoise distinct from the deep blue of open ocean. Choppy water could indicate current patterns or the presence of underwater features. Clouds that formed over Islands building up during the day as the land heated faster than the surrounding ocean could be seen from great distances, a dome of white against the blue sky revealing the presence of land long before the island itself was visible. The expansion into the Pacific happened in pulses, spreading first through the islands of Melanesia and Micronesia, then pausing for over 1,000 years before the final great push into Polynesia around 3,000 years ago. By 1,200 years ago, Polynesian voyagers had reached Rapa Nui, Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, and by around 1,000 years ago they had discovered and settled New Zealand, the last major landmass on the planet to be colonised by humans. This final chapter of expansion represented not just physical endurance, but unparalleled courage and navigational skill, sailing into the unknown with only the confidence that land must exist somewhere beyond the horizon. The distances involved are staggering. The voyage from Tahiti to Hawaii, a route that was made repeatedly as the Polynesians maintained contact between these far-flung settlements, covered over 4,000 kilometres of open ocean. The voyage to Easter Island from the nearest inhabited land required sailing over 2,000 kilometres into the open Pacific, with no way of knowing if any land existed in that direction. These were not accidental drifts, castaways blown by storms who happened to find land. These were intentional voyages of exploration and colonization, planned expeditions that carried not just people, but the resources needed to establish new settlements, seeds and cuttings of plants, breeding pairs of animals, tools and knowledge. The evidence that these voyages were intentional comes from the genetics of the transported species. The pigs, chickens and dogs found on Pacific Islands are genetically related to those from Southeast Asia, showing that they were deliberately carried and bred, not wild animals that happened to stow away. The crop plants, taro and yams and breadfruit, do not grow wild on remote islands. They had to be brought by humans who understood their agricultural requirements and knew how to establish them in new environments. And the settlement patterns, with islands being discovered and colonized in a consistent east to west or south to north pattern, suggest exploration strategies, systematic searching rather than random wandering. But these voyages were also incredibly dangerous. The ocean is unpredictable and unforgiving. Storms could arise without warning, swamping canoes or driving them off course. Becalmed in the doldrums, voyagers could drift for weeks, running out of water and food. Navigation errors, a miscalculation of bearing or a misidentification of a star, could lead to sailing past an island in the dark, missing it by kilometres and continuing on into empty ocean until supplies ran out. The archaeological record of the Pacific is not just a record of successful voyages, but of abandoned settlements, islands that were colonised and then depopulated, possibly because the settlers could not sustain themselves, or because return voyages failed and contact was lost. The settlement of Easter Island is a case study in the risks and costs of extreme isolation. The island, when discovered, was covered in palm forests and supported a population of the large seabirds. The Polynesian settlers cleared the forests, used the wood for canoes and houses, and hunted the birds to extinction. Within a few centuries the island was deforested, and without trees to build seaworthy canoes, the inhabitants were trapped. They could no longer fish in deep water or attempt to return to other islands. The population crashed, and the society collapsed into conflict and cannibalism. Easter Island became a stark illustration of what happens when human expansion reaches its limits, when there is nowhere left to go and the resources of the environment are exhausted. With the settlement of the Pacific Islands, the human diaspora was complete. In the span of roughly 70,000 years, a single species had spread from a corner of East Africa to every habitable continent and most of the inhabitable islands. Homo sapiens had become a global species, the first and only animal to achieve such total geographic dominance through cultural rather than biological adaptation. Polar bears evolved thick fur and layers of fat to survive the Arctic. Camels evolved the ability to store water and tolerate extreme heat. But humans did not evolve to fit these environments. They invented clothing, built shelters, created tools, and passed down the knowledge of how to survive through teaching and tradition. This remarkable capacity for cultural adaptation, for learning and transmitting knowledge across generations, was the key to human success. Unlike genetic evolution, which operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, cultural evolution can happen in a single lifetime. A skilled hunter discovers a better way to knap stone into a sharper blade. Within weeks, he teaches this technique to others in his group. Within a generation, everyone is using the improved technology. No mutation is required. No waiting for natural selection to slowly favour those who happen to inherit beneficial traits. Culture allows populations to respond to new challenges with a speed that biology cannot match. But this cultural transmission requires something that no other animal possesses to the same degree: language. The human ability to communicate complex, abstract information through spoken and eventually written language was the technology that made all other technologies possible. Language allows us to describe things that are not present, to talk about events that happened in the past or might happen in the future. It allows us to share knowledge gained by one individual with an entire community and to preserve that knowledge across generations through storytelling and teaching. Without language, each generation would have to rediscover fire, reinvent the spear, relearn which plants are edible and which are poisonous. With language, knowledge accumulates, building on the discoveries of ancestors who lived centuries or millennia ago. The archaeological record shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated cultural practices as humans spread across the globe. Burials become more elaborate, with grave goods and ochre suggesting belief in an afterlife or concern for the status of the deceased. Art appears in many forms: cave paintings depicting animals and hunting scenes, carved figurines of humans and animals, abstract patterns and symbols whose meanings are lost to us. Musical instruments, bone flutes capable of producing melodic notes, indicate that these people created sound for purposes beyond practical communication, suggesting aesthetic appreciation, ritual, or entertainment. These cultural innovations were not uniform across all populations. Different groups developed different technologies, different art styles, different ways of organizing their societies. Some became specialists in hunting large game, others focused on fishing or gathering plant foods. Some lived in small mobile bands, others formed larger, more sedentary communities where resources were abundant and reliable. This cultural diversity was itself an adaptation, allowing human populations to fine-tune their strategies to local conditions while maintaining the flexibility to change if those conditions shifted. But culture is not just technology and subsistence strategies, it is also identity, the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. Every human society has origin myths, narratives that explain how the people came to be and how they came to live in their particular homeland. These myths, transmitted orally for thousands of years before writing was invented, contain echoes of real historical events, migrations and journeys preserved in symbolic form. The Aboriginal Australians have songlines, complex oral maps that describe routes across the continent, linking sacred sites and encoding knowledge about water sources, seasonal food availability, and ancestral travels. These songlines may preserve memories of the original settlement of Australia over 60,000 years ago, making them among the oldest continuously transmitted cultural narratives in human history. Similarly, Polynesian oral traditions preserve navigational knowledge and migratory histories, describing the voyages that led to the settlement of different island groups. The names of legendary navigators and the routes they took are remembered in chants and passed down through generations of voyagers. Modern research using genetic and archaeological evidence has confirmed many of these oral histories, showing that the migrations described in the stories actually happened, following the routes and sequences preserved in the traditions. This is the power of human culture, the ability to remember, to preserve, and to transmit not just practical knowledge, but history and identity across vast expanses of time. We are not just the biological descendants of those first migrants who left Africa 70,000 years ago. We are their cultural heirs, carrying forward the stories, the technologies, and the accumulated wisdom that allowed them to survive and thrive in every corner of the planet. Every language spoken today, every cultural tradition practiced, every piece of knowledge passed from parent to child is part of an unbroken chain reaching back to the origin of our species and beyond. This global expansion was not without cost. Everywhere humans went, they transformed the landscapes they encountered. Megafauna extinctions occurred not just in the Americas, but in Australia, where the giant marsupials vanished shortly after human arrival, and on islands across the Pacific, where flightless birds and other endemic species disappeared within centuries of human settlement. Humans used fire as a landscape management tool, burning forests to encourage the growth of grasslands that attracted game animals, inadvertently or intentionally altering vegetation patterns across entire continents. The world that existed before the human expansion was a wilder, more megafauna-rich place. The world that emerged afterward was one increasingly shaped by human activity, human choices, and human needs. The ecological impact of prehistoric humans was limited compared to what would come later, but it was real and profound. The extinction of megafauna altered nutrient cycles, changed vegetation patterns, and simplified ecosystems. The removal of large herbivores meant less grazing pressure on plants, allowing woody vegetation to expand in some areas and changing fire regimes. The loss of large predators cascaded through food webs, affecting populations of smaller animals and even influencing plant communities through changes in seed dispersal and herbivory patterns. Humans were not just passive inhabitants of the Pleistocene world. They were active agents of ecological change, reshaping the environments they encountered to better suit their needs. And yet, for most of the time that humans have existed as a global species, our impact was limited by our numbers and our technologies. Populations remained small, scattered across vast territories. Hunting and gathering, even when highly efficient, could only support relatively low population densities. The total human population of Earth 60,000 years ago was probably less than 1 million individuals. Even at the height of the late Pleistocene, just before the advent of agriculture, there were likely fewer than 10 million humans on the entire planet. We were widespread, but we were not yet numerous. We were clever, but we had not yet developed the technologies that would allow us to fundamentally alter the planet's climate and geochemistry. The human population remained constrained by the carrying capacity of the natural environment, the maximum number of people that could be supported by available food resources without depleting them. Hunter-gatherer societies developed cultural mechanisms to maintain populations below this carrying capacity, spacing births through prolonged nursing, infanticide in times of resource scarcity, and territorial systems that limited group sizes and prevented overpopulation. These were not gentle or egalitarian societies. Life was hard, mortality was high, and conflicts over resources led to violence and warfare. But the overall impact on the environment remained within bounds that allowed ecosystems to persist and recover. That balance would be shattered with the Neolithic Revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, and the rise of agriculture. But that is another story, a chapter that belongs to the Holocene, to the world after the ice. The great journey we have traced here, from the Horn of Africa to the ends of the earth, was accomplished by people who lived by hunting and gathering, who carried all their possessions on their backs, who built no permanent structures and left behind only the faintest traces of their passing. They were our ancestors, and they were us, genetically indistinguishable, possessed of the same cognitive abilities, the same capacity for language and abstract thought, the same dreams and fears. When you look up at the night sky and see the same stars they saw, when you feel the warmth of a fire or the chill of wind on your skin, you are experiencing the world as they did. The difference is not in our biology, but in our accumulated knowledge, the tens of thousands of years of learning and innovation that separate us from them. They walked across continents with only stone tools and fire, navigated open oceans with only the stars to guide them, and survived in environments that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. They were tougher than we are, more self-reliant, more intimately connected to the natural world. And they were the reason we are here, the reason every human alive today can trace their ancestry back through that narrow bottleneck, back to a small group of people who looked at the horizon and decided to see what lay beyond. The legacy of the Great Journey is written not just in our genes, but in our psychology. The restlessness, the curiosity, the drive to explore and to see what is over the next hill. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient, wired into us by hundreds of thousands of years of selection, favouring those who moved, who took risks, who ventured into the unknown. The people who stayed behind in familiar territories when resources became scarce often died out or remained trapped in marginal environments. The people who left, who walked into uncertainty, became the ancestors of the rest of humanity. We are the descendants of movers, of wanderers, of people who could not or would not stay still. And that legacy continues. The human impulse to explore did not stop when the last island was settled. It simply changed its focus. We crossed oceans in wooden ships, climbed mountains for no reason other than that they were there, eventually left the planet entirely and walked on the moon. This drive is not rational, it is not always beneficial, but it is fundamentally human, as much a part of what makes us who we are as language or art, or the ability to imagine things that do not yet exist. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander back across those 70,000 years. Imagine standing on the shore of the Red Sea, looking across the narrow strait toward Arabia, wondering what lies beyond. Imagine walking along a coastline that no longer exists, now drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, following the shellfish beds and the tidal rhythms toward an unknown horizon. Imagine seeing land after days of open ocean sailing, a green island rising from the blue, knowing that your gamble has paid off and your children will have a future. Imagine the first humans to see the aurora borealis, the northern lights dancing across the Arctic sky, a phenomenon no human had ever witnessed before. Imagine standing on the shore of Alaska, looking south across a landscape stretching to infinity, empty of humans, waiting to be explored. These moments happened. These were real people, making real decisions, feeling real fear and real hope. And their choices, their movements, their stubborn refusal to give up or turn back, led directly to you. Every human alive today is the product of that journey, the latest link in a chain of survival and reproduction that stretches back without a single break to the very beginning. Your ancestors saw things no one had seen before. They walked where no one had walked. They survived impossible odds and impossible journeys, and they passed down, generation after generation, the knowledge and the genes that made you possible. The great journey is not over. We're still moving, still exploring, still driven by that ancient restlessness to see what lies beyond. But tonight, you can rest. You're safe, warm, and comfortable, protected by the accumulated wisdom of 70,000 years of human ingenuity. The fire is controlled. The shelter is secure. The night predators that once stalked our ancestors are extinct or confined to places far from here. You are the beneficiary of the longest, hardest journey any species has ever undertaken, and you have earned your rest. So close your eyes. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let your breathing slow and deepen. You're connected to an unbroken line of survivors stretching back through time to the very first humans who looked at a strange new world and decided to make it home. You carry their resilience in your DNA, their courage in your bones, their curiosity in your mind. They walked so that you could rest. They endured so that you could have this moment of peace. Sleep well. Tomorrow you will wake in a world they could never have imagined, a world that exists because they had the audacity to walk beyond the horizon and keep walking, no matter what they found. Their journey made your life possible, and in that sense they are not gone. They are here, in you, in every heartbeat and every breath. You are their legacy. You are their triumph. You are the answer to the question they asked when they first looked beyond the familiar and wondered what might lie out there in the unknown. Good night. The journey continues tomorrow.